So, with part seven, we're going to be talking about an issue that came up during Queen Elizabeth's rule, which was an issue of religion. So, to kind of start off, so we talked about how Mary kind of converted the whole country back to Catholicism. Well, then with Elizabeth's reign, Elizabeth was a Protestant, and so she converts the country back to Protestantism. I know that sounds like a lot of changes, but that's what happens when the ruler kind of determines the country's religion. Now, Elizabeth early on was very tolerant of people practicing other religions in England. So she wasn't severe like Mary was with killing people that were practicing the wrong religion, so to speak. Instead, she allowed kind of a more tolerant policy until kind of this issue unfolded. So Elizabeth was a Protestant, and then her cousin was a woman named Mary Queen of Scots. Mary Queen of Scots. Mary Queen of Scots was the Queen of Scotland. Now, Mary Queen of Scots was a Catholic. So she was Elizabeth's cousin. If we're looking at our family dynasty here, here's Elizabeth on the left, and Mary Queen of Scots is right here on the right. So not too far off. They're first cousins, and they both are kind of the rulers of these neighboring regions. Now, Mary got herself into some trouble, though. Mary had the nobles of Scotland turn against her when her husband, and his name was Henry Stuart, was supposedly killed by her lover. So Mary and Henry Stuart were married, and they had a son, James. We'll talk more about James in a little bit. And Mary also, Henry was not the nicest person. He wasn't a very good husband to her. So she had actually a lover, and that supposedly the lover had come up with some type of plot, and Henry was killed and died very suspiciously, and the nobles of Scotland kind of turned against her. Now there were some other kind of underlying issues there with Mary's rule, but they kind of used this as a ploy to attack her. And so Mary was kind of left with no options. So she was forced to what we call abdicate, which means like give up her throne. Abdicate is spelled Abdicate, abdicate the throne. And so she flees Scotland for England to ask Elizabeth for help. So, since Elizabeth was one of her closest relatives, she decides, all right, I got to get out of here. And so she goes to London to seek Elizabeth's kind of protection. So instead, when she arrives, though, Elizabeth has some concerns, as well as many of her advisors, that Mary is using this as kind of a plot to try and take over Elizabeth's crown, because there were still many Catholics in England. And since Mary, Queen of Scots, was a Catholic and a Tudor, she technically was part of kind of the bloodline to take control. And so they were fearful that she would do this. So instead, when she arrives, Elizabeth instead imprisons Mary in the Tower of London. Tower of London is a very famous prison in London that I had mentioned to you before. And since Mary was also a part of the Tudor lineage and was a Catholic, she got pulled into a Catholic plot to overthrow Elizabeth. So while Mary is being imprisoned in the Tower of London, initially she's just kind of pleading, like, I just needed to get away from Scotland. I'm not here to take anyone's crown, etc., etc. But what starts to transpire is she starts to get a lot of communications from people on the outside, kind of writing to her saying, we want to overthrow Elizabeth and we want you to be the queen, and kind of like dragging her into this plot. Um, and so then that kind of becomes like her option. But Elizabeth was very savvy as a ruler, and she had lots of spies everywhere, people that were bringing back intel about what people were doing throughout the kingdom that could potentially threaten her control or her power. And so they were collecting these letters that were supposedly going back and forth between the sides. And once Elizabeth got proof that this was actually happening, well, then as a result, Mary was beheaded for treason. So she was imprisoned, then beheaded. So Mary, unfortunately, was a victim of kind of the tension between Catholics and Protestants at this time. And Elizabeth, by kind of the end of her rule, became very strongly pro-Protestant and anti-Catholic. So kind of almost the opposite then of her sister. So that takes us to the final part of this story, part 8.